So, William Butler Yeats, steeplechasing at Fairy House, adultery at the Metropole Hotel in Cork, and the procedure for obtaining a divorce in Ireland before 1922. All of these come together in the story of Henry Morgan Byrne, who was a barrister at the Irish bar from the 1890s until the 1930s, and his wife, Laura Morgan Byrne, formerly Laura Armstrong. And this couple were, I think, the first barrister and his wife to get divorced, fully divorced by Act of Parliament, certainly in the 20th century. And you can see here just the report, the initial report of their divorce in the Irish courts. Mr. Morgan Byrne is described as a member of the Irish bar, and it is stated that he obtained a divorce from his wife, Edith Laura, on the grounds of her misconduct with Mr. McDowell, a commercial agent. And you can see there that it's described as taking place in the Nisi Prius Court in Dublin before the Lord Chief Justice. And the term used is a divorce. So when we think of a divorce now, we think of an immediate dissolution of marriage. The parties are free to marry again as soon as the divorce goes through. That wasn't quite the case in 19th century Ireland. The divorce that you got from the Irish courts, although it was called a divorce, was what's known as a divorce a mensa et thoro. It allowed the parties to live apart, but did not allow them to marry again. There was a facility in which you could upgrade that into a complete dissolution of the marriage, which allowed you to remarry. But you had to go to England to do it. So you first had to obtain your divorce and then set thorough in the Irish courts, as Mr. Morgan Byrne did. And then you had to bring proceedings in Westminster. You had to have an act of parliament passed dissolving your marriage. And Mr. Morgan Byrne did this too. So this is a copy of the act called Byrne's Divorce. And you can see that it says in clause 2, the bond of matrimony between the said Henry Morgan Byrne and the said Edith Laura Byrne, his wife, being violated and broken by the manifest and open adultery of the said Edith Laura Byrne, the same is hereby from henceforth dissolved, annulled, vacated, and made void, and it shall be lawful for the said Henry Morgan Byrne to contract matrimony. So Mr. Morgan Byrne followed up his divorce and then set thorough in the Irish courts by Act of Parliament to totally dissolve the marriage. You could only get the Act of Parliament if the divorce and then set thorough was for adultery, which it was in this case. And this facility was the only way in which you could get a dissolution of your marriage by divorce in Ireland prior to 1922. So in England, since 1857, it had been possible to get a divorce by going to the courts, which was a much less expensive option, but that was never brought in Ireland. So before 1922, you always had to get your divorce by Act of Parliament, usually after divorce and then set thorough proceedings in either the English or the Irish courts. This all changed, of course, in 1922 when we were no longer part of Ireland, of England, the United Kingdom, so that it was no longer possible to get any dissolution of marriage by Act of Parliament. And in fact, there was no divorce facility in Ireland, proper divorce in the sense of parties being allowed to remarry until the Divorce Act 1996. But all this happened before 1922, when the facility of obtaining a divorce, albeit by Act of Parliament, was still available to wealthy people in Ireland, because you had to be wealthy to go through the procedure of obtaining a divorce by Act of Parliament. So let's talk a little bit about the protagonists in the case, and then we move on just to talk about the facts and the hearing of the divorce proceedings. So this is Mr. Henry Morgan Byrne, and this is a little write-up of Henry Morgan Byrne that was published at the time he applied to be a Unionist MP for West Boughton Division in England, and that was shortly after his divorce. The note describes him as a keen politician, a firm believer and follower of the unionist program, a believer in tariff reform. It says that he was called to the Irish bar in 1891. He's a prominent position on the Northeast Circuit. But it also goes on to discuss his many sporting achievements. So it said he rode in Trinity College, Dublin. It says that he was a well known follower of the County Down Staghounds. He was once accounted a fair amateur jockey, and he has ridden in many steeplechases. And most interestingly, it says that in 1896 he broke his neck at the Fairyhouse races. And he is supposed in Ireland to be the only man there alive who has broken his neck and got it mended again. And indeed, in the newspaper reports at the time, there was reference to him having to wear his neck in plaster of Paris, which was seen as very revolutionary and unusual. But he doesn't seem to have been paralyzed because he continues to play billiards, golfer, and he is one of the pioneers of motoring in Ireland and always drives his own car. So, it sounds like Mr. Morgan Byrne enjoyed a very full and busy life because he was certainly a busy practitioner. He appeared in many reported cases of all nature, all civil nature in the Irish courts and continued to do so up to the 1920s. So, what about Mrs. Morgan Byrne? Well, Laura Morgan Byrne is doubly interesting because she is not only a barrister's wife, but she is also a barrister's daughter. Her father was Sergeant Armstrong, who was a very famous 19th century barrister. And he is known, as well as his superb forensic skill, he's also known for brief periods of insanity. In one of these periods of insanity, he thought he was a rabbit and tried to eat his hat, thereby possibly introducing a new phrase into the English language. But he recovered from that and went on to resume practice and remain equally successful as a barrister. In any event, Laura was his daughter. Now, Laura has a very interesting early history because she was the first love of her distant cousin, William Butler Yeats, who met her in Howth when she was engaged to Henry Morgan Byrne. Laura was staying at the house of a judge, Mr. Justice Wright in Howth. A lot of judges had homes in Howth at that stage, holiday homes, and she was staying there. And Yeats saw her out driving in a pony carriage, her red hair blowing in the wind. So it sounds a little bit like this beautiful illustration of A Girl in Dublin Bay by Haywood Harvey, which you'll see on the left. And W.B. Yeats's father called her a most fascinating little vixen, and they had a flirtation right up to her marriage, really. But she did not dump Henry Morgan Byrne for W.B. Yeats or anything like that, and he probably would have been a bit young at the time. He was 3 years younger than her, and he was only 19 or so at that time. So that's the early history of Laura Armstrong. But she was more than just a muse to poets. She had considerable musical talent in her own right, because in the early years of her marriage, when she and her husband were living in Larne in Antrim, he was practicing as a solicitor at that stage. She is noted for her beautiful performances at concerts, singing, and also, as you'll see in this clipping, for another unusual method of performance, which involved whistling operatic arias. So it says here, we must refer to a novelty introduced by Mrs. Morgan Byrne of Larne, who electrified the audience by exquisitely whistling two different operatic selections. And the Armstrong family, as well as being known to be eccentric, were also known to be very musically talented. So Laura was typical of this. So in any event, after Mr. Morgan Byrne became a barrister, they moved to Ashtown, County Meath. A good hunting country, also handy for the courts, both on the North East Circuit and also in Dublin. He would have been going to both sets of courts. So it's a lovely house. They lived there in Ashtown until 1904 or so, when Laura moved to Prince of Wales Terrace. It was originally Bridge in Dublin. It was originally reported that both of them were moving to Dublin, but then the cat got out of the bag a little bit when there was a robbery at Ashtown, and Mr. Morgan Byrne defended off burglars. So why was he still in Ashtown defending off burglars if his wife was living in Prince of Wales Terrace? And at that point in time, the parties did up a deed of separation, but there was no question of adultery at that point, as we'll see. So we now go on to the court case, which was heard before the Lord Chief Justice in the Four Courts in Dublin. So you can see an image of the Four Courts there. And Laura would have been intimately familiar with the Four Courts through her father's work there. I'm sure she would have visited many times. It would not have held any terror to her. But as it happened, she didn't turn up for the divorce proceedings. So what did happen at these proceedings? Well, as Laura wasn't there, Henry Morgan Byrne was the person who had to give evidence. And he said that although they'd lived together for a considerable period of time, a separation agreement was executed on the 1st of July 1906 in consequence of differences between them, but not in consequence of infidelity. And then Mr. Morgan Byrne says that in November 1906, he got a communication casting an aspersion on his wife's character. And he got this communication from her aunt's husband, which is unusual that he get that communication from her side of the family. And I think this must have struck the Lord Chief Justice as unusual too, because the Lord Chief Justice then said, is there any collusion between your wife and yourself in reference to these proceedings? And Mr. Morgan Byrne said there is not, but we'll come to that. So, what was the evidence against Mrs. Morgan Byrne of adultery? And the evidence shows that a woman really had to be quite careful in order to avoid being accused of adultery back in 1907. So, first of all, her maid gave evidence about having accompanied Mrs. Byrne to the Metropole Hotel in Cork to meet Mr. McDowell. He was the gentleman she was accused of having committed adultery with. They went to the Metropole, the Empire Theatre. Then they went home to Prince of Wales Terrace. There were dinners at the North Wall Hotel. The maid accompanied them on all these excursions. But the maid said that Mr. McDowell also stayed overnight in the house. And on one occasion, she came into her mistress's room in the morning and he was sitting at the end of the bed reading her the newspaper. So, if you had gentlemen sitting at the end of your bed reading the newspaper, even if they weren't actually under the covers, you would be in trouble in terms of subsequent adultery proceedings. So they also stayed together later in the Metropole Hotel Cork. So you can see there just an image of the Metropole Hotel Cork, and the night porter in the Metropole Hotel said that they had luggage, that Mrs. Morgan Byrne was carrying two little black dogs, and they had rung up in advance a telephone message requiring a room to be kept for Mr. McDowell and his wife, and their names were entered in the hotel books. So there was a clear chain of evidence there. He was also able to identify Mrs. Morgan Byrne by a photograph of her that her husband produced wearing motoring clothes. So we know Mr. Morgan Byrne was a keen motorist. So at this point, we get a bit of curiosity from the judge again, because the Lord Chief Justice says, who is Mr. McDowell? What is he? And counsel for Mr. Morgan Byrne says he's a commercial traveller for a city firm. So obviously the Lord Chief Justice would have known the Morgan Byrnes and would particularly have known Laura Morgan Byrne well. And he was obviously consumed with curiosity about who was this man who had seduced her away from her marriage. But his curiosity was never really to be fulfilled, and maybe wasn't capable of being fulfilled in this particular case. So then we get on to Laura's solicitor. So he was no longer a solicitor, having been discharged, but he turned up in court to present a letter from her to the court. And at the very beginning, when he announces himself to the court as solicitor for Laura, the first thing the judge says, showing his prior knowledge of Laura, is she was in a lunatic asylum, wasn't she? And Mr. Collins said, I only acted in connection with this matter, but I heard it. So that indicates that Laura had spent some time in an institution in the past. And that would reflect the Armstrong family tradition of eccentricity. So the letter then from Laura read, Dear Mr. Collins, I must again reiterate what I previously written to you, and after further consideration, I am still of the same opinion that it is better to let the case go by default. I cannot forget that my husband was good and faithful to me for over 20 years, and if he thinks it is expedient that he ought to be divorced now, so be it. This is final. So that was the letter from Laura. So she was not going to attend to defend the proceedings. And then there's just a discussion as to who was advising her when she wrote the letter. She was accompanied to Mr. Collins' office by a woman in black. And the name of this woman was not announced in court, but it was written on a slip of paper and handed up to the judge, obviously, so that a woman who was a friend of Laura's would not have the indignity of her name being mentioned in divorce proceedings, because they were seen as very scandalous at that time. So, some other interesting information. Again, we find the judge circling back to this mysterious seducer, Richard McDowell. And Mr. Collins said he never saw Mr. McDowell. He never thought that Mrs. Byrne was going to marry Mr. McDowell. And at this point, the Lord Chief Justice said, "Who is Mr. McDowell? Is he a wealthy man?" And Mr. Morgan Byrne's counsel said no. And Mr. Collins said, "I heard he was secretary to some trading company." And Mr. Byrne's counsel said, "Mr. Byrne doesn't even know what he looks like." So this was all very mysterious, this Mr. McDowell. And there was no further evidence. The Lord Chief Justice said the usual statement: this was a very painful case, and the charges were proved, and a decree and mens et thoro was accordingly granted. So then, obviously, we have the application by Mr. Morgan Byrne to Westminster for an Act of Parliament dissolving his marriage with his wife, and that is granted. And there was actually a little write-up about it in the English papers, talking about the different procedure for Irish marriages and how they had to be divorced by Act of Parliament if they wanted to remarry. That obviously wasn't required in England, but it was required in Ireland until 1922. So it just mentions that the Irish law courts are not possessed of the power of granting a complete divorce, and then it just goes on to set out the background. But it does mention, you can't see it in this clipping, but it does mention that Mr. Morgan Byrne had subsequently brought proceedings, separate set of proceedings, against Mr. Richard McDowell, claiming compensation, damages, for criminal conversation, which was damages that you could get if somebody committed adultery with your wife. You could claim damages from them for criminal conversation. And Mr. Morgan Byrne had brought proceedings in the Irish courts after the divorce of mens et thoro, and he had been awarded £200 or thereabouts against Mr. McDowell. However, the interesting thing was that the mysterious Mr. McDowell did not turn up at all to defend the proceedings, and the only address given for him was Grafton Street. So he was Mr. Richard McDowell, Grafton Street. And, you know, I mean, he probably never got the proceedings. How easy is it just to send something to someone in Grafton Street? He didn't turn up. Did he even exist? There's no record of a Mr. Richard McDowell who fits that particular pattern. So one wonders if he was a real character or if he was invented. And the reason for this is because there was a subsequent marriage. Both parties, both Morgan Byrnes married not long after the divorce. Both of them married. Mr. Morgan Byrne married and produced a daughter called Peggy Morgan Byrne, who's very famous. She was a noted Irish sportswoman, a swimmer, horse racer. You can see her there on the left. She looks a bit like her dad, just on her horse there coming in after a winning race. But Mrs. Morgan Byrne, Laura Armstrong, she also married, and she actually married in 1908, again very soon after the Act of Parliament, but she didn't marry Mr. McDowell. She married a gentleman called Thomas Williams, and that's corroborated by a note in a Yeats biography, a biography of W.B. Yeats's father. I'll link it, the reference. And this says that she married a Welsh gardener. He was a very decent and intelligent man, but she nagged him and was taken by whims, and he was forced to leave her. So that would corroborate the records which record Laura Morgan Byrne, otherwise Armstrong, Edith Laura Morgan Byrne, otherwise Armstrong, as having married a Thomas Williams in Wales in 1908. So if she was already close to Thomas Williams by 1908, enough to marry him, it seems a little unplausible that there would have been a relationship with Richard McDowell maybe a year or two earlier. It just seems strange that she managed to switch from one man to another at that time. And again, one wonders whether Mr. McDowell was just a device there to avoid any of the parties that the Morgan Byrnes subsequently married from being named as parties to the divorce. Certainly, the Lord Chief Justice was intrigued but didn't pursue it further. So, just a couple of other things. I think Mr. Morgan Byrne, he died in 1938. I'm not sure when Laura died. She was living in Hampshire in the 1920s with another lady by the name of Armstrong, who I presume was a relative. And as I say, Mr. Morgan Byrne ran as unionist candidate in England, but didn't get that candidacy. But he remained a well-known figure in the Dublin courts for many years, right until the 1920s or so. So, what does this case tell us about Ireland? I suppose it gives us a very good insight into how the process of obtaining a divorce and being able to remarry worked in Ireland before in 1922. And obviously, it was no longer possible to get a divorce and remarry between 1922 and 1996. It's sometimes easy to forget that there was, in fact, a thriving family law industry in Ireland in the 19th century. Not only did you have divorce proceedings, but you also had criminal conversation proceedings, damages for adultery, and so forth. So we often forget about that and think family law in Ireland began in 1996. It took up a tradition which had lasted much, much longer. Some of the most famous family law cases ever were in Ireland in the 19th century. It also, I suppose, gives us an insight into the background of members of the legal profession in Ireland and how they lived. And it has to be said, Mr. Morgan Byrne certainly lived very well, although it's not clear exactly what family money he had or indeed what family money Laura had, but seems to have been a very comfortable existence. And I suppose, thirdly, then it just gives us an insight, I suppose, into one of the muses of Irish literature, often forgotten, but first love is often one of the most important, and Laura Morgan Byrne was the first love of W.B. Yeats. So I suppose that's the other reason why this is significant. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed that. I link to my sources. I link to my sources also, so you can follow them up. Thanks very much.